Welcome to episode 8 of Positively Geared. My name is Alex Augustiniak, and I join Lloyd today to discuss the topic of property market cycles as we debunk some of the myths commonly associated with property market cycles in Australia. Welcome, Lloyd.
Hi, Alex.
Today we are going to discuss the property market cycle. There's a chapter in your book, Positively Geared, devoted to this very topic, and it's myth-busting the property market cycle.
Absolutely, for sure.
What is a market cycle?
Okay, so the analogy I like to use is if you just think of the clock. If you look at the top of the clock, where the clock is at 12 o'clock, that's really the top of the cycle. At 6 o'clock at the bottom, that's the bottom of the cycle. The period between 6 o'clock through to the top of the clock is the growth phase of the cycle. And then from 12 o'clock downwards, that is the decline of the cycle. That's really the cycle and how it works there.
A lot of people, Lloyd, often look at market cycles at base level, being that there's only one property cycle across all of Australia, all of the country, which in fact is not the case. Can you walk us through, and our listeners, what some different cycles possibly look like, depending on the area you're buying in?
Absolutely. There's quite a lot of myths surrounding the property cycles. There's definitely not one property cycle in the country. We probably should preface that by saying there's also not just one property market in the country. So I always refer to the Australian property markets as exactly that, the property markets. So when it comes to cycles, it's property cycles. The other thing to consider also is that not every area experiences great cycles either. So if you look at markets that really do grow a lot, such as Sydney and Melbourne, they have real cycles where over generally a 7 to 10 year period, you can really experience a large amount of growth, and then the property cycle stops and then it starts again. Other markets such as Adelaide and even Brisbane, they're a bit softer, a bit slower. So the markets move at different paces. What's really important to consider there, though, is that they move at different times. So you might buy in Sydney during the growth phase of a cycle, and then once it gets to the peak of the cycle, that's really not the right time to be buying there. So if you're going to buy an investment property, then you'd buy in another area where the market would be starting to increase, which historically is Brisbane, that moves after Sydney. And one other thing to consider also is that regional areas, those country towns, don't really have cycles in the same way that cities do.
So in terms of being able to review market cycles and use that tool to determine A, the best time to buy, and B, the best place to put your money, is there a golden rule of thumb that you generally follow, Lloyd? Or, for example, if somebody's determined that they want to purchase in Sydney, for example, is it absolutely essential that they ride out and wait for that next cycle? Or what's your general advice around that?
It's not absolutely essential because it does depend on strategy, what you're trying to achieve. But what I do recommend is that you don't buy at the peak of the cycle or at the downturn. So you really should be buying, whether you're in Sydney or any other market, you really should be buying at the start of the growth cycle. So around about 7 or 8 o'clock on the clock, that's when you might be seeing a decrease in the days on the market, bit of an increase in attendance to open homes, an increase in the auction clearance rates. Those are all signs that the market's really starting to move. Some commentators will say you should buy in a booming market, but I disagree with that because you should actually buy before the market booms.
What are some of the metrics or tools that you'll use to, obviously without having a crystal ball, to assess which markets are more probable to boom depending on their location and what's going on in a broader sense?
It really comes down to things like infrastructure, government spending, population growth, jobs growth. Those economies that are more susceptible to large cycle growth, places like Sydney and Melbourne particularly, that really have those factors.
In terms of some of the myths around the property cycle, or more sentiment towards different property cycles, we hear quite frequently a lot of buyers wanting to sit on the fence, anticipating making a decision in 6 to 12 months' time because, they feel that that's when the market's going to pick up, whether they're a seller. If it's a buyer, it's, we're going to wait another 3 to 6 months because we're waiting for the market to slow down a little bit more. We actually think we're going to get better buying, Lloyd, in 6 months' time. What's your advice to people that have sort of found themselves sitting on the fence for a bit too long?
My advice is that now is always the right time to buy. The cycles do move in different times. So you might be thinking that you need to buy in the Sydney or the Melbourne markets, but really look elsewhere. For good buying opportunities. Look elsewhere for growth opportunities and for yields. Sitting on the sidelines isn't really going to help you because, we haven't really seen those big crashes or those big market slowdowns that is often predicted. And at the most, we're going to see a 10, 15% slowdown perhaps, but then things change very quickly. The other thing that you can do to help mitigate things is actually find properties where you can actually do a bit to them. If you add some value to your property, then you don't need to be too reliant on what the cycle is doing anyway. And that's particularly prevalent if you're buying in regional centres.
So when discussing the topic of growth, not all markets and not all property cycles, all property cycles will experience growth. However, often it's either positive and it can also be negative growth. So it's not necessarily always a case of growth, meaning that the property is appreciating in value. Lloyd, in terms of areas where there has been negative growth, sometimes at face value, it could appear that it's just a market waiting to experience its boom. Quite often we'll hear people saying, I'm looking to invest in this area because it's been on the decline for a while, and that must mean that it's going to have its time shortly, and therefore we believe it's a good place to park our money. However, that's not always the case, is it?
Very true, Alex. And a couple of markets come to mind there. From 2010 to 2020, so over the last 10 years, there are two markets that actually had a decrease in prices, two capital cities, and that was Perth and Darwin. That's because they're too reliant on the resources sector, particularly Perth. And people often think, Perth's going to, it's a good place to park money now because the prices are down and they're going to start increasing again. But the fact that that's been one of the only markets to actually have a decline in prices is actually not a good thing. It's not a particularly strong place to put your money ever since the resources sector declined around when the mining boom ended around 2012, 2013. So that's very important. And in investing in places that really have a lot of industries for growth are really important.
On the contrary, too, Lloyd, there are markets which will experience positive growth over a period of time. Sydney and Melbourne being probably stronger markets in that respect in terms of being blue chip, for lack of a better term. However, also that doesn't necessarily mean that those particular areas are going to, over a longer period of time, experience constant positive growth. Sometimes we do see different areas cap out before others. Does that make it harder to know where to put your money, or is it a case of sort of hedging your bets?
I don't think it's a case of hedging your bets, but I do believe that you always need to be looking at your strategy and what you're trying to achieve there. No one's got a crystal ball. So it's true that, if you've invested in Sydney or Melbourne over the last 10, even the last 20 years, you've made a lot of money, and the same growth has not really occurred anywhere else. But what's important is that you can still invest in those other areas, but you need to look at other ways to make your money there, which includes adding some value to your property. So that's quite important there, because those other markets don't experience the same booms as what Sydney and Melbourne do, but they also don't experience busts as well. So that's something to keep in mind, with one exception there, and that is staying right away from a one-horse mining town, because something that's reliant on only one sector, the sector doesn't do very well. Those industries do have a large decline when things drop out. So, you can be getting lots of growth, getting a really high rental yield. Then if something happens there, then you lose all that. And I experienced that in one of my properties as well. So I know firsthand with that sort of thing.
Lloyd, one of the concepts you cover off in your book, Positively Geared, and we've touched on over the course of our podcast series, is manufacturing growth. And effectively what that is the contrary of relying on a property market cycle. It's creating instant equity in a home. That in itself is debunking a myth that you need to time your purchase in line with when a market's likely to boom and then sort of ride that wave.
Yeah, very true, Alex. So I mentioned a little while ago that, you can sort of peak when a market's starting to rise, it get to 7 or 8 o'clock in the market cycle through either a decrease in days in the market, so that properties are starting to sell a little bit quicker. Maybe auction clearance rates are increasing. There's more people looking at properties and things like that. However, that doesn't instantly mean that suddenly prices are going to keep increasing in that particular market. So what you can do to really control things is to be able to add value to your own property. So if you do a development, a subdivision, a renovation, things like that, that adds value, then you're effectively creating your own little cycle, if you like, in your own portfolio. That's something that I love doing, and something that has really been very kind to me in my portfolio over the years. So while we're talking about market cycles here, it's just a very broad thing we're talking about. I do go into more detail in the book. However, I still want people to realize that you shouldn't be just relying on the one, on just trying to pick their market cycles to buy, because there's plenty of other ways to actually be making money on your property as well.
It's a very good point. In terms of digging a bit deeper into property cycles, we look at the Sydney market. Let's say that we saw the last real boom probably start around 2013, moving into 2014, and then it sort of reached its peak in 2017. That cycle, unlike previous cycles, was halted by what I would call artificial measures, being we did see a Royal Commission on Finance. So all of a sudden there was a massive stop sign on credit. The banks made lending very difficult. Obviously last year we then saw the market sort of rebound, particularly after the federal election. We saw the Royal Commission finish, and since then the market sort of found its feet again. What I have identified over that period of time is that supply has continued to diminish year on year. Now, does that, in your opinion, alter your perception of where we're actually at in a cycle, on the basis that we're still seeing quite strong prices, particularly in the first quarter of this year? However, given that supply is a lot lower, is there ever a time where you sort of sit down with your clients and think, okay, well, if the supply does start to meet demand, possibly we're not in as strong a position as we initially anticipate?
Yeah, that's very true, Alex. And that's all a part of understanding the markets and really educating my clients on that, because I think some of the price increases so far have been a bit artificial. It's amazing how much the sentiment changed after the election last year, when the Morrison government got back in, and everyone was worried about the potential changes to negative gearing and things if the shortened government was to get in. When that didn't occur, suddenly, everyone was wanting to invest in property again. The sentiment changed, and then the Royal Commission was kind of behind us and everything like that. However, what we started to see towards the end of the year was a fair bit of FOMO. People were sort of jumping in because they were worried about missing out. There wasn't much stock on the market and everything like that. So I think that was artificially raising prices a little bit there. The problem with vendors, they weren't listing essentially because they thought, I could get more for my property next year if I listed it then, because prices are starting to increase now. But now we're into that next year. We're sort of approaching the halfway mark of the year, and people are still not really listing their properties because they're thinking now, it's coming up to winter, maybe we'll wait till spring. So yeah, that is a bit of a issue. So we do need to be careful of that, and we do need to sort of monitor that and have an understanding of that, and check those listings and have an understanding. That's where it's really important to understand strategy and where the property purchase fits into your portfolio, because the listings can improve or can increase later in the year at the drop of a hat if people start to list more.
How important, on the topic of supply versus demand, and obviously that plays a big role in any market cycle, how important is it for you to invest in areas where there's a healthy level of supply and the demand's also there? Because obviously you don't want to be investing into areas where there's an oversupply of property and not enough demand. That's a big red flag. But you also don't necessarily want to be investing into areas where there's very low supply. And obviously demand is probably preferable to supply. But is there a golden rule that you follow or that you look for?
Well, I do like to invest in areas where there is actually fairly low supply. So because that's what's really going to be pushing your property price up. So it's hard to buy a property in where there's high demand and not much supply of properties, because you may end up paying more than you want to. But at the end of the day, you're just paying what the market determines. So while you can argue that you might be overpaying, it's really just paying market value at the time. But if you're buying into a really good area that has all the amenities, all the good infrastructure, then that should go for the long term. So it should be a good investment and everything like that. But you definitely don't want to be into a market that's oversupplied, which is what we've found with units in the Melbourne CBD, which is what we've found with townhouses and units in Brisbane. And there's certain pockets in Sydney as well that in the unit market, in the apartment market, that is becoming oversupplied as well. So we need to be careful of all that. So really getting something with a low supply. The other thing I like to look for, though, is something that's a little bit unique in your property, something that's going to outperform the averages. So, for example, if you're going to buy, an apartment complex or a townhouse complex, buy something that's a little bit older and a little bit smaller. So rather than buying in a massive apartment complex, buy something that's a bit smaller that might only have 5 or 10 units in there. Being a bit older means you can add some value to it, and a few things like that. That's a little bit different to say buying something brand new and things like that.
Really good advice there. And Lloyd, for somebody who has possibly purchased a property, they've now identified that it probably wasn't at the ideal time in that market cycle, or they're finding that it's a market that's achieved negative growth. Is there generally a contingency plan that you have in place to sort of get them out of the mud, so to speak?
If they're buying the wrong time of the cycle, I mean, at the end of the day, I always recommend people have a buffer in place. So they shouldn't be paying more than they can afford on a property. So they always need to have a buffer in place in case valuations come in short, or in case they need repairs on a property. And that can also be used if they want to buy a property or they do buy a property, and then their plan is to leverage some equity off that property to buy another property, but then it actually goes backwards in value so that they get that equity that they want. Then having a contingency plan of having a bit of deposit left on the side will help them get into that other property anyway. So that's a contingency plan there. But at the end of the day, the key really is to try to make sure you get into that good market to start with, and doing all that research up front.
And that buffer, by definition, Lloyd, would that typically be a percentage value of the purchase price? Is it just having 20,000 in the bank as a reserve in case you need to draw down on that money? Or
look, that kind of changes between people really, and whatever you can afford really. But yeah, I generally suggest between 5 to 7% of the property purchase price.
Looking back at the last Sydney property cycle, if we can use that market as an example, so Sydney metropolitan. Where do you see that heading over the next, say that we're sort of entering a new cycle now? What do you see happening in the metropolitan area?
Yes, it's very interesting at the moment because inflation is still really struggling at the moment, but interest rates are still falling. So the Reserve Bank is still decreasing interest rates to try to stimulate inflation. But that's really keeping the house prices moving along. So I see still a lot of growth occurring. There's still a shortage of stock on the market, and I see this growth occurring well beyond this year into next year. So I think we're definitely at the start of the next cycle. I do think that people are worried about other things, about whether Australia's heading towards a recession or anything like that. But I never get involved in worrying about things like that, because I think there's a bigger picture to look at. I think the government's in pretty good financial situation, and they're injecting money into trying to prevent downturns as much as possible. I think that if you're sitting on the sidelines thinking that something's going to you're going to be, the economy is going to be worse off and the house prices are going to decline, so you should buy next year, you might be surprised to find that the house prices are going to be higher next year. So my advice would be still, if you can afford to, get into the market now. That's
great advice, Lloyd. And we often hear people, particularly after the last boom cycle, thinking that Sydney was, right at its limits in terms of growth. However, once we did see that pushback in 2018, the market seems to be comfortably finding its feet here now, and probably will experience more of a subtle trend upwards over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what people probably don't realise at the moment also is that the house prices in Sydney at the moment are really back to where they were in 2017. So we had about a 15% decline in prices since that cycle ended. And now since the market started to increase again last year, we're back to where they were in about 2017. So things aren't that crazy at the moment. They just started to increase again, and they're back to where they were. And I think they'll keep increasing beyond that.
What are some other myths that you cover off in your book, Positively Geared, regarding market cycles?
One of the things that that I talk about a lot, and that's, I think, is quite important, is that all properties increase in value, because not all properties do increase in value. It's really important that you're buying in the right location and you're buying the right property for that location. So firstly, obviously buying in the right location means that you're buying an area that has many drivers for economic growth. So you don't want to be in a one-horse mining town, as we've mentioned several times. So make sure you've got several industries that'll help drive that town. So if one of those industries collapses, you've got other areas that still prop up the town, keep that moving forward. The other thing that's also very important is buying the right property for the demographics. For example, if you're buying a property out in, say, Campbelltown in Western Sydney or southwestern Sydney, you don't really want to be buying yourself a one-bedroom unit there when most of the families out there, their families living in 4 or 5 bedroom houses. So if you buy a one-bedroom unit there, it's probably going to get negative growth, or certainly not going to get any positive growth. So that's an example of buying the wrong property in the wrong location. So again, just because there's good overall house price growth, it doesn't mean that if you just buy any property there, that it's going to increase in value. So you've got to buy the right property for the right demographic, make sure it's close to amenities, close to transport, and all those kind of things. Very, very important.
Really good points, Lloyd. So just to recap, it's very important to not just look at any market geographically speaking and assume that because housing is performing strongly or apartments are performing strongly that, every single property in that location is going to achieve good capital growth over a period of time. Does the same apply for rental yields?
Yeah, the same. Absolutely, Alex. Yeah, absolutely. So again, if there's no demand for someone to live in a one-bedroom unit somewhere, then it's not going to rent out. You need to buy the right house for that location.
So Lloyd, we're talking about the property market cycle, and a lot of people may just be looking at that solely from the perspective of home values. The rental market, which is something that as an investor, it's very important to be across, also it really endures its own property cycle. And in terms of its relationship with the overall market cycle, what's important to look for as an investor to ensure that you're setting yourself up for success?
One of the most important things, Alex, to look for is vacancy rates. So 3% is considered equilibrium. I always try to invest in areas that have less than 3%, preferably 1 or 2% vacancy rates. The other thing that I like to look for is a good owner-occupied to renters ratio. And I like to look at 75% owner-occupiers to 25% renters in the market. 25% means that there's enough potential renters available to rent, to rent the property. But 75% owner-occupiers means that you're actually investing in an area that is predominantly owner-occupiers, because they're the people that really drive growth. They're house-proud type of people. So that's all very important, I feel. The other thing to also, I guess, keep in mind when you're renting out a property is the times of the year. So, for example, it's probably potentially a little bit harder to maybe rent your property in winter, or at least get premium rent for it. So, for example, if you're trying to rent out a property in winter, you may have to ask a little bit less for it to be able to get to secure a tenant. What I often recommend there is that perhaps only just have a 6-month lease, and then you can re-advertise in the summer months, maybe for a higher lease. The other higher rent, or the other thing you can do is maybe have tenants in there on a 12-month lease, but have a clause written in the contract which states a $10 a week increase after 6 months or something like that. If you're leasing your property in autumn or spring or even summer, it's often easier to secure a tenant. However, keep in mind that if it's in summer, close to Christmas isn't too easy. Some areas that are driven by universities, if you're renting around a university, then you might be looking at, February might be the better time to rent. So you've got to keep those sort of things in mind as well.
Absolutely. And Lloyd, in terms of just spending a little bit more time on the rental aspect of property cycles, is it absolutely essential that as an investor you have there ever been instances where markets have declined over the course of a few years, and landlords are having to settle for a slightly smaller amount of rental return per week? Is your recommendation just to get a tenant secured in there for the longest period of time possible in order to ensure that your yield's as good as it can be?
Yeah, so sometimes landlords tend to be maybe a little bit too greedy for rent. So even if it's suggested to them that market rent might be $400 a week for a property, sometimes landlords might want a little bit more, so they'll put 420 on it, then they're not renting it out. The other thing also is that maybe if it's a softer time of the year or the market's a little bit soft, they might be better off advertising for 380, but they're insisting on advertising for 400. But the problem is that if they don't rent it out at all, they're actually losing 380 a week, as opposed to if they rent it out for 380, they're only losing the 20 a week that they would have by having to reduce the rent by 20 a week. So that's kind of important to consider there. So I always get quite realistic about that. What's the market? I take advice from my property managers, and if they suggest I should rent for a certain amount, I go with that without being greedy, without trying to accept another, trying to get another $5 or $10 if that's going to put things at risk. The other thing also is that rentals do actually sort of work the same way as when you're buying property. So rentals can actually decline if the market really declines. And for example, when I bought a property in Queensland mining town of Blackwater, I paid about $260,000 for it. It was renting out for $800 a week. So that was massive yield at the time. Then when things collapsed around there, it ended up renting for $200 a week. And fortunately, I only had one property like that, but I've sort of lived through that, learned from that experience. But there's a few people around that had quite a few properties like that, and that can be an issue within itself as well. So you need to really be buying in areas that have all the economic growth drivers in place to make sure that you're not going to suffer those sort of consequences.
When building a portfolio which is designed to achieve a long-term outcome. We talk about strategy a lot in this podcast series and in your book, Positively Geared, Lloyd. Quite often you'll hear people say, but when markets do trough during a cycle, look, we should have waited another 12 months before we bought, and sometimes they're kicking themselves. But I think it's really important to underline the holistic approach to investing and just reminding everybody that's listening that investing is it's a long-term approach, and values of homes will change 1,000 times within a week or a month or a year, and it's just important to always have that end target in mind.
Totally, absolutely, Alex. So you've just got to keep that end goal in mind, keep yourself accountable to that. It's about what you want to achieve. So we set a 10 or a 15-year time frame. That's what you're working towards. So, and I keep referring to my example of Blackwater, and I've highlighted that in the book because that went from being very positively geared to actually being negatively geared. However, overall, my portfolio is still positively geared. So, I didn't let that one thing affect me. I just made sure I had good decisions elsewhere, and I moved on, and I learned from my mistakes. But it didn't stop me from investing further. It didn't stop me from moving forward. It's really important to actually stick to your goals, keep yourself accountable, have someone else, maybe a mentor that can keep you accountable. And just remember that you're in it. Yes, absolutely. You're in it for the long term.
In terms of reflecting on your portfolio, you just mentioned that it is positively geared. Drawing on the time in those various market cycles, when you've purchased, were they always generally in favourable conditions at the time, or do you have some good anecdotes? And I suppose you've already touched on one with Blackwater, but are there any other stories of times where you have bought in markets which then did subsequently endure potential declines, only to obviously over a longer period of time prove to be well purchased?
Well, the other thing I talk about a lot, Alex, and I talk about it a lot because I really want people to learn from what I've done in the past and the mistakes I've made, and to also realize that you can actually make mistakes and then still achieve. And that's what's really important. That's what I want to try to show people. Because when I first started out, I had no strategy, didn't really know what I was doing. So I bought my first property just after the boom of the Sydney 2000 Olympics. So the market was on a high, and subsequently, the first 5 years of my investing, in the first couple of properties I had, received no growth, potentially negative growth. I was buying at the wrong time. So that's the thing that really stands out for me, because I just didn't have a strategy at the time, and probably later on it didn't matter so much to me. I mean, obviously I learned a lot more about how cycles work and what I can do to mitigate my risks there. But then I also got into manufacturing growth, and that's the thing that really turned things around for me.
In terms of you mentioned the first few properties you bought after a period of time almost achieved negative growth. Beyond manufacturing growth, I think being able to possibly a strong tool to mitigate risk is being in a position to hold an asset. You never want to put yourself in a position where you're, forced to sell at a loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you might need to sell a property to be able to move forward. And there are times that I've worked with clients where we have made a decision to sell a property, even if it is at a small loss, because it allows them to move forward, particularly if they're maxed out with their lenders and things like that. But where possible, you need to be able to, get through these times and not actually sell a property, because I talk a lot about buying my first property at the wrong time. But since then, and that was about 18 years ago, since then, it's tripled in value and it's been a very good property for me. So it was still ended up being a really good property. It's done well for my portfolio and it is now positively geared. So the other thing I probably should emphasize is that not everybody has to buy property and manufacture equity. So I talk a lot about that. Not everybody has to go and do a renovation or do a development or anything like that, because if you buy the right property in the right location, you will get growth. That's the way the cycles work if you do it at the right location. And that's what's happened with a lot of my properties, that I've just held them and I haven't done anything with them and they've continued to grow. But it is long term. And quite often you don't have a lot of time in your portfolio to just wait and hold property. So that's where strategy comes in important, whether you're just going to hold property for the long term or whether you're going to manufacture growth in the short term. So that's why we need to work out that strategy in the beginning.
You've now held your portfolio, Lloyd, for the better half of 2 decades almost. Was there a tipping point in your property journey where you started to really see the benefit of market cycles working in your favor?
Yeah, I think there was probably, I was probably halfway through my portfolio building. So it was probably, probably about 10 years ago or something when I really sort of understood when to buy and was diversifying. So I understood that, get away from a cycle that's declining or a boom, and actually understand not to buy in this cycle because it's the wrong time, and realize that I can go and invest interstate. It's a better time to buy in the cycle.
So was your first purchase interstate about 10 years into your portfolio building, or was it earlier?
My first purchase interstate was, it was probably 6 years after after I first started investing.
And in terms of looking at, a lot of people, associate property cycles with their ability to purchase an asset and experience, a strong amount of growth over that period of time. Was it sort of 10 years in where you started to see the biggest return on a lot of those purchases you made, factoring in that you mentioned for the first several years there was some of them had achieved negative growth? Yeah,
I guess the other thing I need to mention here really is that the biggest returns that I made was when I started to manufacture equity. So when I started to buy at the right time of the cycle, those properties started to do very well. But that was still over a period of time. So again, it comes down to strategy and holding for the long term. So I might have bought a property in 2010, and by 2016, 2017, it had made a lot of growth. And for example, and I think you mentioned earlier, Alex, that the last Sydney boom started around about 2013, went up to 2017. It so happened that we bought, my wife and I bought a family home in about 2011, 2012. And then we actually were at the benefit of a lot of growth through that period. That was in Sydney, in the West, and it doubled in value. And then we sold that to help fund our dream home, along with some of my investments. And so we benefit from some getting that property at the right time and benefiting from a lot of growth in the cycle. So I've really benefited from that. But in the short term space, being able to manufacture equity and knowing when to do that is key.
In summary, Lloyd, probably the biggest takeaway from today's episode is that a property market cycle does not exist. Australia is made up of many market cycles, and just as it's made up of many geographical markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that.
Thanks so much for your time, Lloyd.
Anytime, Alex.
As we just learnt, property market cycles is not a generic term. Property market cycles apply to different areas geographically and regions and suburbs. Lloyd uncovers this topic in far greater detail in his book Positively Geared. I strongly encourage you grab a copy of Lloyd's new book so that you too can uncover your path to financial freedom. In the next episode, we discuss another very important topic, the importance of using a buyer's agent. Lloyd Edge is the director and founder of Oz Property Professionals, a successful buyer's agent firm in Sydney, Australia. Lloyd will be discussing with us all of the tips and tricks and reasons why you need a buyer's agent on your side when bidding for your next property.